but we are talking about the one person who stands out in everybody's mind, Anne Boleyn. Born in Blickling, the Bolyn family residence in Norfolk, just outside of Norwich. It wasn't Hever Castle, which was built by her ancient relative and great-grandfather Geoffrey Bolyn in 1501. A common misnomer, basically. No, but we have to actually address the main issue, which is the way in which she inveigled herself into the English psyche. To do so, we have to look at Henry VIII, of course. Now, contrary to popular opinion, Henry did not like his ladies so young. She was 31 when she got shackled to the Isle, a good age to settle down, one might think. But not for the reason we take for granted today, no, because she spent her life in a constant quest for security, which is something that, if taken to extremes, can cause a toxic personality and corrupt healthy relationships if they're known. One thing we have to understand here, right? The Tudors were the product of a medieval yesterday. And in understanding that, we are not to gander at the nature of the expectations of the stormy populace, but in the context of an adhesive adherence to God and the structures he pipes of inevitability. Inevitability and predestination according to the adherence of his pleasure or displeasure. Her father, Thomas Bolyn, was on the Plantagenet side of the last war, and so had a great deal to hoot about, and he soon became the skilled diplomat and a royal chancellor, and ended up the treasurer of the king's household. So Annie had the toughest start, being brought up by a pater with such schizoid peers in the first place. Perhaps akin to some of our big top hats today, who use their fame as sounding planks in support of their careers. There's not much known about Elizabeth Howard, Annie's mother, but it is evident that she had a great deal of emotional impact on Annie, and was very much a mater figure. Apparently, 60% of women are religious, and a very significant part in their lives versus 40% of men. The Bolyns gave Annie a polished education. Annie not only expressed herself with loquacious grace, but was fluent in English, so much so that she became a valuable toolbox to her father's dip manoeuvrings. Now, Annie was schooled at home. Tudor education had little to do with reading and writing, and everything to do with the root memory and instilling young minds with the basic tenets of the Christian creed. Anne Boleyn would have read Ecclesiastes, and he said, honour your father in word and deed, and God will bless you. And Annie's education in France Burgundy is down on paper. When she made steps back to Blighty, she looked forward to impressing Catherine Aragon with her French. To start with, Annie was very much into impressing the Queen and really getting up there as high as she possibly could. It was never her original intent to become so highly sought after by the King than she actually was in the end. This is to her credit, as well as her close adherence to God. Now, getting off the point slightly, French fashions were very highly thought of and brought up in the Renaissance period, and so much of English sosh were influenced by them. Now, there were many languages and court capers. Intellectual and social deck prevailed in this environment, and highly religious mindset of the Tudor period in general. More contemporary to Annie's gen are the words of the bookworm Thomas Aylott in his book named The Governor. He said, "Hath God not set degrees in the states in all his glorious works? First, in his heavenly ministers, whom hath constituted in divers degrees, called hierarchies." Thomas Wolsey and his sovereign, King Henry VIII, not only carried on with his old alliance, fancying the Habsburg side of things, but also tried to act as a totem between France and the growing Habsburg political and military power. Perhaps President Biden had recently condemned and slated Donald Trump's corruption in his recent trial, has swooped into the hearts of Britain, along with the feel of their fight against the lack of inclusion and diversity that continues to splatter in our faces daily. That diversity and inclusion has recently shot all over our night dress, as I watched the last episode of Good Omens last eve, pervading popular culture and free speech to an unprecedented degree. England was a wiener compared to France in population and wonga matters, and England was always afraid that they'd let their vocal pops slip. The Scots would get through the back door. Fear and hunger stalked the land as they do today, like two great stalking things. But Annie then went to Paris again to be lady-in-waiting to Mary Tudor. Mary became a widow at 18, and the king's son continued his scrap with the Habsburgs. Annie remained in France for another 6 rounders. Although Annie's later enemies did their best, there is no paper trail that Anne acquired in France a rep similar to that of her sibling Mary, who also spent a spat in Paris on Mary Tudor's court as a great, wanton and notoriously infamous woman. Annie had bigger fish to fry. 16th century beauty was so different from ours. The standards of the time rested mostly in the eyes and the miles between them. Annie became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen and schooled her in French. Catholics turned her into a bally beast with a gouttiere or wen on her neck, protruding teeth, sallow skin, and a 6th finger revealing her demonic heritage. The Venetian ambassador stood somewhere in betwixt. Not one of the handsomest women in the world, he said. She is of middling stature, swarthy complexion, long neck and wide mouth, and a bosom not much raised, and eyes which are black and beautiful. Annie was well aware of her seductive powers and made a lot of them. Only moons after her death, a French poet, Lancelot de Carles, penned lyrically about her gorgeous eyes, boasting that she used them to good effect, sometimes leaving them at rest and others sending message to carry the secret witness of her heart. He was a lyricist himself. Annie made herself noticeable by adopting the French fashions and etiquettes she brought over with her. She just turned 20. Sexual attraction and political control potted into a single campaign when Annie eared the secret to success with the control of the king's conf. Could we see in this Carrie Bolyn, Boris Johnson's wife? Cardinal Pole, in stately Rome, penned, "At your age in life, with all your experience of the world, you were enslaved by your passion for a girl, but she would not give you a will unless you rejected your wife, whose place she longed to take." This was written by Pole of King Henry VIII, long before the English king claimed planetary power over his subjects' souls as well as their bodies in the new nation-state. Cardinal Pole had marked his way. The scandal between Annie and Thomas Wyatt was due at best, but a fancy made up by his verse. Whilst Annie's imprisonment in 1536, Wyatt was arrested for a stint, pointing that he was regarded as being one of the Bolyn faction, of which we'll talk later. Not a solid arg. Some say that Henry both minding of Wyatt's alleged pash for Mistress Bolyn and dangerously jailed the poet. Others choose to cuss on a date after Henry took Mary for the old nuptials to make their thoughts. It was 1526. Badmouth the idol, and it becomes impure. Very much like the recent trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. We ought to have been able to read this in detail at the spawn of this love, because history holds 17 love letters headed to Annie and written by the king himself. We also ponder on whether the king was comparing the Bolyn sisters in the sheets. The letters indicate two minds as to who was actually holding out on who, insofar as courtship was concerned. Now, 6 years consequently passed, and Annie held out for the stakes were most worth winning. Now, am I the only one who is seeing the Markle conglomerate here? Henry argued Annie to wait until he could wangle a legit marriage. He was afraid that they could not keep it in their pants, and so living together without the question at the point. The king had already enjoyed munching Annie's pretty duckies, and he needed all the self-control he could badly master, and couldn't forget what had happened to her sis, which could have contributed to her abstinence. Now, Henry's decision to divorce Catherine came a whole calendar before he popped the question to Annie. But did they actually have anything in common, other than the blindingly? I mean, it seems that Henry was exhausted with having a 45-year-old wife who could no longer have children and had had umpteen miscarriages. Except, of course, Princess Mary, who was not a boy elves. But there must have been some teeth grinding concerning her marriage to his dead brother, Prince Arthur. In 1522, when Henry proposed, he had leafed through the good book and found a pass that said, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is a very unclean thing, and he shall not have children." Now, by placing the decision to have the marriage annulled well before the passion for Annie had appeared, both the king and his biographer escaped the charge that conscience was being made to cover up for the pash. In all likelihood, the 1527 dispensation was a nugget in the king's campaign to lure Annie between the sheets. Now, Annie appears far more traditional Catholic than usually presented. It was 5 rounders before the marriage was sealed, during which time Annie had popped a child, so their abstinence couldn't have been that strongly adhered to. According to Sebastian Gustinian, the Venetian ambassador, Henry was very religious. He heard 3 masses daily when he hunted, and sometimes 5 on other days, besides attending vespers and complines. There was a whisper, before Arthur died, that Henry was even going to be archbishop, though the longer the wait went on, the more Henry had dissatisfaction with his deity. He even originally made scathing barks on Martin Luther's work. Now, he had fought mightily to defend the church against the Lutheran heresy, and now seeked a proper return on his bout in the ring, a trend that is set as so tapping impatience it's now an accepted norm. The recent controv surrounding Russell Brand and his usage of the cult of personality to lure and groom women into his sanctum is wont to spring to mind. Lutheran Protestantism, Henry spouted, robs princes of all power and authority. For what shall a king do if he cannot appoint any law, but, like a ship without a rudder, suffer his people to float from the land? Now, his huffing and puffing with God couldn't have been helped with his accident in 1526, when he was injured in a jousting match where the Duke of Suffolk and started to suffer with headaches and gout as a result. He started to feel as if God had turned his back on him. Annie was not exactly of the same mind, but close. After an attack by Emperor Charles of the Holy Roman Empire and Francis Bolyn of France, the Pope went into hiding. Henry VIII was in the process of appealing to the Pope over the marriage, and his sudden fleeing into the Castel Sant'Angelo really actually put a stick in the works. Charles, therefore, the Holy Roman Emperor, decided to protect his sister's, we're talking Queen Catherine here, matrimony rights. The Pope, therefore, could not simply pop a word in his lobe that Catherine should retire to a nunnery, thereby allowing him to admit the remarriage of her husband. Now, by 1529, Henry started to give up on the Pope. Cardinal Wolsey, of course, blocked Annie's marriage to Henry Percy. And this was back in the day, and was a key factor in setting up the Bolyn faction, which was a parliamentary force to continue Henry's pursuit of marriage. Boris Johnson's Partygate, anyone? Which, funnily enough, is just being turned into a Channel 4 spoof series that resembles the likes of Malcolm Tucker in the thick of it. Now, despite her dislike of Wolsey, Annie saw his hand in promoting the marriage and wrote frequently to him to such an effect. It was 1531, and after Henry brought Thomas Cranmer a sliver in 1529, the king determined to use Cardinal Wolsey's treason in violating the ancient statute of primogeniture as a way of swiping money from the Church of England as a whole. Yeah. He threatened to exaggerate Wolsey's crime to the entire church, thus putting the bullseye on Wolsey for the entire failure and setting up his own club in Parliament. Now, this was a given, a helping hand by a set of monks he had set upon finding a solution to the problem. Professor Ives, a contemporary at court, portrays Annie as the driving force behind the king's great matter. Henry is ousted in the mentioning, and all radicalism is put down to the Bolyn faction, especially Anne, her father, and her brother. She was the main party, though, in insisting that the king meet Thomas Cranmer in the first place, and she made demonstrations of joy, as if she'd actually gained paradise. Thomas Tyndale preached strong but appealing music to the king's ears. All men, without exception, are under the temple sword, whatever names they give themselves. Henry VIII was also tickled by what he read, and he tried to hire Tyndale to pen propaganda for the king's great matter. Now, in January, lastly, Annie and Henry were wed. Annie had held out against the king's desires for 6 years, rather like a spin on Donald Trump using a union workers' strike at an auto plant to pose for a photo opportunity. Legislative plans were used to gain mass attention. The two finally jumped ship in November when they visited the continent. Annie had been dubbed Marquis of Pembroke in September, with a full court in the seat and escorted by the Dukes Norfolk and Suffolk. Though the nuptials took place in October, it was said to have cost the king at least £6,000. Annie was 6 months pregnant at the time of her coronation, though, and born in September we had Elizabeth Tudor, Queen Elizabeth I, of course. According to Professor Ives, Annie played a major role in pushing Henry into asserting the headship of the church. She proved to be an adept politician by dispensing with the king's chief minister of almost 20 years. She helped the thinking of her sovereign's views of kingship, and as the wife of the monarch, she had the position of a much-needed alter ego, a Protestant without harking it. Now, we are reminded her of many a nefarious and infamous duo at this point. Meghan and Harry stealing what they can of all praying Spotlight, for example. Horrifying. And then there's Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, putting aside her recent display of disrespect in the Cleopatra fiasco. The arrival of the nation state, first in England, later throughout Europe, with its profound changes in the function and status of the individual in society, was a triumph that followed a path almost outside of the Reformation. The nation state commenced as a centuries-old process, popping out of the mist of a feudal past that culminated in 4 booming events, potentially imitating the first stages of the starting pistol to Brexit. Though who initiated it? Was it Anne herself? We see the consequences of her choices even today with the latest plans within the Brexit business and the Windsor framework. In 1534, Henry was to be taken, accepted, and reputed the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Anglica Ecclesia, and shall have and enjoy annexed and united to the imperial crown of this realm all honours, dignities, preeminences, jurisdictions, privileges, authorities, immunities from profits and commodities to the said dignitary of supreme head of the church. A new kind of loyalty oath was invented. In the Act for the establishment of the King's succession, passed in 1534, after which his nuptials were booted as null and void, that is to say, his nuptials to Queen Catherine, as she was, and Annie's lawful daughter was to inherit the crown. But Annie had a miscarriage, and Henry was forced to ferret around other girls during this period. He ordered her to keep her eyes shut and endure just like others had done before her. Like Catherine naturally bought it in 1536, and with her dead, the impoverished loving status slightly as Anne wore yellow to celebrate. It was late in the year in 1536 when the King and Annie went on a trip to Wiltshire, to Wolf Hall, where they met Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, according to Sir John Neal, was fair, not dark, younger by 7 or 8 years, gentle rather than abrasive, of no great wit, against a mistress of repartee, and a model of female self-effacement, against a self-made woman. When the King sent her a full purse of gold, she returned them unopened, saying, "A gentlewoman born of good and honourable parents, and with an unsullied reputation, had no greater treasure in the world than her honour," rather like Russell Brand declaring that he blamed the big tech companies for his fall from grace and then asking for money to support his claims. He said, "Collusion between the big tech government and apparent concerted effort by legal media, and now the state and big tech to silence the independent media voices. You know, I have been demonized on YouTube, fully aware that the government wrote to the social media platform to demand I further be censored." With the late Queen out of the picture, a diplomatic revolution seemed to be on the cards, with England and the Habsburg Empire once again joining the club. For Cromwell, it added up to a single conclusion: Annie must go. She imperiled the country and Cromwell's career. Now, this is a clever thingy, but ho-hum. Annie's concluding speech to the court. "I do not always say that I have always borne towards the king the humility with which I owed him, considering his kindness and the great honour he showed me, and the respect he has always paid me. I admit, too, that often I have taken it into my head to be jealous of him, but God be my witness if I have ever done him any other wrong. Nauseous interest in arranging for the French executioner to kill his wife. It cost the crown £23.6 to hire the expert, and an exorbitant sum." Upon hearing her head block, Annie said, "Good Christian people, I have come here to preach a sermon. I have come here to die. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you to pray for me. Today we have people like Tim Stanley of the Telegraph using massive Catholic rhetoric, slagging off institutions like the BBC, as Lawrence Fox might tattle. Yet another instance of the cult of personality akin to the French Axeman affair. Yet here we are. Henry was formally engaged to Jane Seymour on the day after Anne's execution and was married on the 30th of May. The bigwigs of the Conservative Party took Queen Catherine and her daughter Lady Mary down a peg or two, saying they were not very effective leaders. As a clubette, the Conservatives consisted of the old Plantagenet faction, plus a few key members of the King's Privy Chamber, in particular Nicholas Carew. This leaves Thomas Cromwell as the mastermind behind Anne's destruction. If the Conservatives played such an important role in the Queen's fall, did the destruction of the monasteries and the attack on the church settlements and the images continuing unabated? And why was Lady Mary forces, with an arm behind her back, to accept her father as the head of the Church of England as well after Anne's death? Anne was a diplomatic burden, interfering with the King's chief minister's efforts to take advantage of Catherine of Aragon's death and renewal of the old alliance between Emperor Charles V and the supreme head of the Church with his schismatic church. The cult of personality had prevailed, though it was her own fault by looking to the stars in the first place and exposing herself to the dangers of the 16th century, a century that is sim to the 21st in its corruption and gaping usage of popular culture to its own ends. Her dripping, disrespectful comments about the leaders around her didn't help either, even if you do devote yourself eternally to God. Anne was an adulterer, a manipulator, as used by a corrupt conservative government, but she was a cunning and devious, and sought to do so in the midst of those much better at such matters than herself. Though her involvement in breaking from the Church of Rome shows her to be the first to be manipulated herself through the cult of personality that found its roots in this tumultuous time, we could say that she had only herself to blame, but it was infecting those around her, and that used her ambition against her interest. In the end, Anne was a fervent believer in her Christian faith, and should be applauded for such. And the cult of personality always prevails, it seems, especially for those that exercise seduction techniques of all kinds. I'll see you later, guys. Give us a good clicking.
Si shaka na